heard this before. And I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, Jeff Snider versus the mainstream. First, let's go over what the mainstream narrative is, so then you can see how Jeff Snider smashes that to bits. The repo market is set up for the banks and the financial institutions to trade collateral for cash overnight or for a specific term. The mainstream narrative is that there's too little cash in the system and way too much collateral. This creates excess demand, not enough supply, and that's why the rates in the repo market spiked, and the Fed has had to come in and inject liquidity to make sure that the whole system doesn't collapse on itself. The reason they say there's too much collateral and not enough cash is twofold. Number 1, the government has been running massive deficits. That means they need to sell more treasuries. Generally, they're selling this amount of treasuries. Now, they're selling this amount. The problem becomes these primary dealers are the market makers. So they are required to buy the treasuries that the government spits out by spending more and more money buying votes, going to war, and spying on you. Good stuff. So there's more treasuries going to the primary dealers, and of course they're using cash or liquidity to pay for those treasuries. So there's more collateral coming into the system and cash going out of the system. While that's happening, the Fed was doing QT, or quantitative tightening. Of course, now they've reversed that. But again, this mainstream narrative is that while the government was producing excess collateral and taking that liquidity out of the system, the Fed is doing the exact same thing. The process of QT is when the Fed takes assets or treasuries, collateral, from their balance sheet and sells them back into the market. The people buying those, or the entities buying those, are typically the same primary dealers, and they're going to have to pay with that with liquidity or cash. Generally, it's cash that they have stored with the Fed in the form of reserves. So those reserves go to the Federal Reserve for those treasuries. The Fed incinerates the money. That reduces the base money supply, and that creates this environment where there's more collateral, tons of collateral, going onto the shoulders of the primary dealers, but the liquidity is being sucked right out of the system by the government and being completely incinerated by the Federal Reserve. Now let's look at Jeff Snider's shocking insights. He believes there's plenty of liquidity in the system, and although there can be some counterparty risk that's involved here that the lenders really don't like, such as Deutsche Bank, he thinks the biggest problem is there's not enough good collateral in the form of treasuries. And that may not make any sense at all with the government running trillion-dollar deficits. But let's go to a recent interview with Jeff to hear him explain it in his own words.
The monetary system has never been healed. And one big reason why is the repo market. The repo market has existed under what's, essentially a collateral shortage. There isn't enough of the best quality collateral for people to, when I say people, I really mean, mostly banks and financial institutions, not just in the U.S. That's what I was talking about before with offshore. This is a global system where everybody trades and funds in U.S. dollars and U.S. dollar positions. So there's really a shortage of the best quality collateral to work in the repo markets. And because of that, that's one constraint upon why haven't we moved past 2008? Why haven't we moved past the financial crisis? And a big reason is because there's a collateral problem. And it's a collateral problem the Fed doesn't have any real ability to fix. The repo market was filled with not just treasuries treated as the best collateral, but also mortgage bonds. The mortgage bond market and agency bonds too, which are, the GSEs, they get involved in the mortgage market too. So you have to think of a lot of the collateral, what was treated as the best quality collateral in the system up until the housing bubble was the assets of the housing bubble itself. And so all of those subprime and prime mortgage tranches that were, rejected during the crisis up until then had been treated in the repo market as the same as treasuries. So as the crisis evolved, what happened was the repo market started to reject all of those mortgage bonds, all those MBS securities, and said, you know what? We're just not going to take them, or we're not going to take them on the same terms as we're taking treasuries and repo. And so effectively, the collateral list, all the stuff that's the really highly prized, pristine collateral, that list got pared almost in half at the onset of the crisis.
To further understand what Jeff was saying on the Bob Murphy Show podcast, we have to look at collateral as two separate pie charts, before 2009 and after 2009. According to Snider, we had plenty of collateral before 2009. The problem was that collateral was garbage, and the lending institutions going into the repo market didn't understand the risk involved. You may be asking, well, George, what type of collateral was in there? Well, let's take a look. They had mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, oceanfront property in Arizona, even IOUs from your friend and family member Fred. Now, all of that garbage collateral is wiped out of the system. The lenders don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. So although there are more treasuries in the system to be used as collateral, there's a lot less collateral as a whole. This is how it looked in practice. The repo rate spiked up to 10%, so the Fed had to come in and inject emergency money that they just printed out of thin air into the repo market to keep the repo rate down near Fed funds at 1.5%. If they wouldn't have intervened, rates today would be much higher than 1.5%, maybe even higher than 10%. They'd be in this area I refer to as the DVZ, or Doom Vortex Zone. And trust me, you don't want to be there. That's when the whole system collapses in on itself. So before, the system had all this collateral, like we were saying over here. Now, it's just got this much good collateral, although there still might be the same amount in the system. It's just these primary dealers won't accept this anymore because they saw the risk that was involved when the system crashed before. So Jeff's point is there's plenty of liquidity in the system. There's just not enough good collateral. So if you only have this much collateral, you can only use that much liquidity. That's when the Fed has to step in and pump in all of this cash that the market isn't willing to provide. Jeff also points out that the dealers aren't required to hold those treasuries that they have to buy from the government. The government deficit spends like a drunken sailor. All of this collateral, treasuries, come raining down on the primary dealers, but they could just flip them into the bond market, take that cash, inject it into the repo market, and make a double profit. So the fact that they're not willing to do this shows Jeff that it's a collateral issue and it's not a liquidity issue. And to prove if Jeff is right or wrong, all we have to do is pull up a chart of excess reserves from today going back before the great financial crisis. Editor, let's throw up that chart right now. Before the great financial crisis, the entire dollar funding market, including the repo market, needed less than $2 billion. After the great financial crisis, now in 2020, the system has $1.5 trillion in excess reserves compared to $2 billion before. So Jeff Snider is right on the money. We definitely do not have a liquidity issue. Step number 2, does the data refute or support Jeff Snider's claims? To start, we go back to the Bob Murphy Show podcast for another clip of Jeff Snider talking about how the collateral issues in the repo market are getting extremely shady.
There's a very tortured history behind the repo market that gets into why it's called a repurchase agreement. In the older days, it actually was a purchase and a sale. So in essence, you're agreeing to sell a security and buy it back, at a predetermined time. But that gets into all sorts of other details about who owns the assets while the transaction's going on. And there was a whole bunch of court cases, Supreme Court cases, tax law that defined, is this really a repurchase agreement or is it really a collateralized overnight loan? And it doesn't have to be overnight. It can be term loan, but essentially most of these are overnight loans. And what happened over time, especially in the 70s and 80s, is that evolved into, it's not really a repurchase agreement. That's what we call it. And so it's the shorthand of repo, because it's actually a collateralized interbank overnight loan. There's no actual transfer of title involved. The collateral posted is really, if I'm borrowing cash from you and putting up a U.S. Treasury bond as collateral, I still own the bond, even though it's in your possession.
Whoa, time out. Did you get that? The ownership of the collateral doesn't transfer parties. It doesn't even physically move. So the entity that is borrowing that cash still has ownership of the collateral that they're pledging to the group that is giving them that money. So this repo market really isn't a repurchase agreement market. It's barely even a collateralized loan market. It's basically a wink and a handshake market. And would you want to do a handshake deal with Deutsche Bank? I don't think so. Back to the podcast.
Essentially what has happened is that at various times over the last 12 years, the system itself has tried to make up for that shortage of collateral by doing some really strange and in some ways some really I don't know if the right word for it, but things that really make your skin crawl. They've taken what is essentially, when we talk about something like securities transformation, they've taken what is essentially a junk bond and swapped it for a U.S. Treasury. I'm talking about one financial counterparty to essentially a bank dealer. And then the party that starts with the junk credit has now swapped it for a U.S. Treasury credit and then takes that Treasury credit into the repo market, because otherwise you show up in the repo market with a junk credit, you're not going to get the same terms, which is what you were talking about. Maybe what is the real rate that should be in the repo market? Well, the repo market only sees that Treasury, even though the Treasury isn't really belong to the person that's presenting it to the repo market or the financial counterparty that's presenting it to the repo market. And so there's been a lot of securities transformation that takes place, especially in the last few years in the global repo market, that has essentially hidden or masked a bunch of risky behaviors that I think these dealers probably understand very well, not only the nature of those risks, but also the degree to which they've happened. And so one of the reasons I think that they are increasingly shy and sitting on their hands no matter what the repo rate rises to is because they know that the collateral system, the way that the system has tried to deal with the collateral shortage by essentially manufacturing new collateral in very unsavory ways, that it presents another sense of risk that they're then taking as, hey, I don't really want to do this liquidity stuff because I know that there's a lot more risk out there than people probably realize is taking place.
Let's unpack what Jeff is saying a little bit further to understand how those deals are being done in the repo market that, according to him, really make your skin crawl. We know that the entities providing liquidity into the repo market really only want treasuries as collateral. That's why the amount of collateral in the system has dropped so dramatically since the great financial crisis. These financial institutions and hedge funds still need liquidity from the repo market. So what do? To fill that void, they've got to come up with some creative solutions. As an example, one of these financial institutions will go to a primary dealer and they'll say, listen, buddy, we've got this toxic sludge on our balance sheet. We'd really like to give that to you, and then you can give us some treasuries, and we'll pay you a little bit of a spread to do that. And the primary dealer says, oh, geez, okay, fine, I'll take the toxic sludge. The Fed always has my back, and they'll bail me out anyway. Then the hedge fund or financial institution that traded the toxic sludge to the primary dealer for those treasuries will take the treasuries, put them into the repo market, and then primary dealer B or a different primary dealer won't know that those treasuries are backed with toxic sludge. They'll just see the treasury. So they'll say to the financial institution or the hedge fund, yeah, fine, we'll give you the money for that. Then the financial institution takes that money, will pump it right back into the FX swap market where they'll get a much higher return. And where do you think that money goes from the FX swap market? Most likely your favorite bank, Deutsche. There's another piece of the puzzle that I'd like to address that Jeff doesn't go over in the podcast. Before the great financial crisis, the Fed controlled interest rates, buying and selling treasuries. Now they can't do that because they've injected so much liquidity into the system through quantitative easing, the rates would never get above zero. So they created this new system, if you will, IOER, that's interest on excess reserves. They also do IOR, which is interest on reserves. Sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple. The Fed goes to all the Wall Street banksters that we know and love and says, hey, listen guys, if you park all of your reserves with us, we will pay you for that. And the banksters say, wow, that is fantastic. Risk-free money. We will do that, Federal Reserve. And the Fed controls the floor of the Fed funds rate because they know that the banksters won't lend into the market at a rate of interest lower than what the Federal Reserve is paying them risk-free. So as always, the Fed is creating additional moral hazard and unintended consequences. Oh, but wait, there is more. Remember, quantitative easing is when the Fed goes into the bond market and does what? Buys treasuries, in other words, collateral. At the same time, we have a collateral shortage in the financial system, in the repo market. The Fed is taking collateral out of the financial system in the form of QE. You just can't make this stuff up. And we haven't even talked about rehypothecation yet. Fancy word, isn't it? It's very important that you understand what this is. Let's go to a chart editor right now of how much rehypothecation has been in the market since 2016. Over $1 trillion. This is straight from the New York Fed's website. And check this out. The most significant contracts used to rehypothecate collateral are repos. So you may be asking yourself, George, now how does that really work? I've heard of that word, but it sounds complicated. But again, it's pretty easy. This is you. You have some treasuries. You want to keep your treasuries stored, so you go to your brokerage or financial institution and you say, hey, financial institution, can you store my treasuries in my brokerage account? And the financial institution says, sure, no problem. Just go on your merry way. They're safe. Just nothing more to see here. They take your treasuries and they inject them into the repo market as collateral. Their collateral. A, B, or C, or the entity that's giving them the money, doesn't realize that those treasuries are actually yours. The financial institution takes that money, they go right back into the FX swap market with the money that they've borrowed using your treasuries as collateral. And where does that money go? Most likely, right back to Deutsche Bank. Although we understand what Jeff Snider is talking about, it doesn't necessarily refute or support his claims. In order to do that, let's check out the mortgage-backed securities used as collateral in today's repo market. And the Fed, fortunately, has this on their website. What I did is had Sebastian aggregate all of the data so we could see if there's been an increase in mortgage-backed securities repos since September. And this is information you will only get on this YouTube channel. And thank you to Sebastian too. This is a lot of hard work. What we saw is the amount of mortgage-backed securities being used as a percentage of total repos since September has gone up by 30%. This supports exactly what Jeff Snider was saying. Why? Now that there's an indiscriminate lender in the repo market, all of the financial institutions that need that cash can use the toxic assets that they have on their balance sheet. That's why we're seeing the amount of mortgage-backed securities used in repo increasing dramatically. Step number 3, the end game, Triffin's Paradox 2.0. To make sure that we're on the same page, let's look at the definition or what Triffin's paradox actually is. The Triffin paradox is the conflict of economic interests that arises between short-term domestic and long-term international objectives for countries whose currencies serve as global reserve currencies. The country whose currency foreign nations wish to hold must be willing to supply the world with an extra supply of its currency to fulfill world demand for these foreign exchange reserves. Triffin's paradox tells us the country with the world reserve currency status needs to create a lot more of that currency than it actually needs. It has to supply the entire world. Because there's additional supply, that could put downward pressure in the future on that currency. But the country doesn't have a choice, because if they stop supplying the world with their excess currency, then the whole system comes crashing in. So ironically, by having the world currency reserve status, it puts you into a position where you'll most likely lose it in the long term. This takes us to Triffin's Paradox 2.0. As we know, our current economy has been so financialized that it's really supported by the entire financial system. And this would hold true for really all the developed economies. So it's very important, for the sake of the real economies around the world, that the Fed and the government prop up this financial system, which is propped up by the dollar funding market, because we have the world reserve currency. If we have a collateral problem, like Jeff Snider is saying, that means that the government is in the position where they have to continue to provide this collateral that the financial system pre-2009 was providing on its own. If it's providing more collateral, that means the deficits are going up and up and up. We already have 23 trillion in debt, and the deficits are already 1 trillion plus per year. At some point in time, all these additional treasuries, all this additional government spending is going to have to reflect in the bond market. That means that interest rates will go up. Well, as you guys know from watching all of my videos, the financial system would collapse with higher interest rates. So the Fed would have to come in with QE infinity, print money, buy all those bonds to keep those interest rates low. So what ends up happening is the US could lose the reserve currency status because it has to print so much money to provide that collateral to prop up the entire system, just like it would have to in Triffin Paradox 1.0. Different circumstances, same paradox. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.